This is a reading from Evidence of Satan in the Modern World by Leon Christiani. It was translated by Cynthia Rowland, and it has a nihil obstat and an imprimatur, which was given back in the 5th of June 1961. Introduction. When we declare that a certain statement is or is not gospel truth, we are trying to say that it is or is not strictly credible. Christ, to Christians, is the final authority to which we submit in all confidence, faith, and love. Even to unbelievers, Christ is one of the most outstanding personalities in history. He is the personification of sincerity and truth, and is recorded as saying, "Let your word be yes for yes, and no for no. Whatever goes beyond this comes of evil." We should therefore inquire what Jesus thought and said on the subject of Satan. Here the gospel, as on all other points which concerns man's spiritual life, is normative and definitive. Even if this should no longer be true for those who have lost their faith, it is nevertheless impossible to understand the mentality of previous centuries in France without reference to the Gospels. Those who had or believed they had had contact with the devil, those who had endured his onslaughts, like the Curé d'Ars, those who were regarded as possessed and subjected to a more or less effective exorcism, have all interpreted their state in the light of the Gospels and the traditions derived therefrom. Let us therefore see what the Bible has to say of Satan, and how it records cases of possession and the expulsion of devils. In particular, we should note whether Christ himself believed in the existence of Satan. The temptation in the wilderness. The first event to attract our attention is Christ's temptation in the wilderness, recorded in 3 Gospels. They show Christ and Satan meeting face to face. We should note, however, that there was no witness to this formidable encounter. The 3 evangelists derive their account from Jesus himself. He took care to inform his disciples of what had passed between the devil and himself. He wished them to know what he had seen, what it had meant to look each other, as one says, in the eye, to listen to Satan's attempts to subjugate him and make him deviate from his path. In a word, Christ had wished to be tempted, and he was. He revealed to his followers what this temptation had been. Satan had shown him all the kingdoms of the world, saying, "I will give thee command over all these, and the glory that belongs to them. They have been made over to me, and I may give them to whomsoever I please. Come then, all shall be thine, if thou wilt fall down before me and worship." Luke chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. The temptation, therefore, was not a slight one, but on a world scale, on a scale Satan considered appropriate to his task. Jesus, for his part, admitted Satan's predominance in all the kingdoms of the earth by thrice calling him Prince of this world. John chapter 12, verse 31, chapter 14, verse 30, chapter 16, verse 11. Father Lagrange speaks of these accounts of the temptation in the wilderness, compares them with the prologue of classical tragedy, in which the theme of the forthcoming drama is announced and, as it were, prefigured. The battle in the desert between Christ and the devil is such a prologue. It tells us everything about Christ's mission, which was solely to overthrow the dominion of Satan. St. John was to say in his first epistle, "If the Son of God was revealed to us, it was so that he might undo what the devil had done." 1 John chapter 3, verse 8. We might therefore expect the Gospels to be full of the work of Christ against Satan, and of Satan against Christ, and they are indeed so, to an astonishing degree. It is impossible to understand the Gospels without the certainty of Satan's existence and of his activity amongst us. Some examples. It would not be possible to list every instance in which devils are mentioned in the New Testament, and we shall quote only some important examples. Jesus began to preach in Galilee, and St. Mark writes that he cast out many devils. Mark chapter 1, verse 34. Before the Sermon on the Mount, the crowds gathered round him, and St. Luke tells us why: to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled by unclean spirits were also cured. Luke chapter 6, verse 18. For, says St. Matthew, they brought to him all those who were in affliction, distressed with pain, and sickness of every sort, the possessed, the lunatics, the palsied, and he healed them. Matthew chapter 4, verse 24. In the case of Mary Magdalene, it is made clear that Jesus had cast out from her 7 devils. Luke chapter 8, verse 2. When Jesus sends his apostles to preach in Galilee, he gives them power to cast out devils. When they return, he greets them joyfully. I watched while Satan was cast down like a lightning flash from heaven. Luke chapter 10, verse 18. When Christ healed the woman who for 18 years had suffered under some influence that disabled her, and the ruler of the synagogue waxed indignant because it was the Sabbath, Jesus replied, What, you hypocrites, is there any one of you that will not untie his ox or his ass from the stall and take them down to water when it is the Sabbath? And here is this daughter of Abraham, whom Satan had kept bound these 18 years past. Was it wrong that she should be delivered on the Sabbath day from the bonds like these? Luke chapter 13, verse 10 to 16. There is also the casting out of the devil called Legion, because of the number inhabiting the possessed person. Legion asks to be allowed to pass into a herd of swine. Jesus permits this, and all the swine cast themselves into the lake, where they are drowned. The 3 synoptic gospels, particularly Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. This element of burlesque is remarkably evocative, giving us an exact indication of demonic character and nature. It reveals their psychology, to which we shall return later, and what they do when in possession of a human being. They introduce into and maintain in the possessed person, writes Monsignor Catherinet, morbid disorders akin to madness. They possess an acute sense of discrimination and know who Christ is. They prostrate themselves before him without shame, praying and begging him in the name of God not to cast them back into the abyss, and in order to avoid this fate, beg to be allowed to enter into the swine and remain there. Scarcely have they entered into the swine, than with a vigor as astonishing as their versatility, they provoke the cruel and wanton destruction of the creatures they have been granted as a refuge. Fearful, obsequious, powerful, malignant, versatile, and even grotesque. All these characteristics, so well defined in this story, reappear in varying degrees in the other gospel accounts of the casting out of devils. To sum up, it is impossible for any serious historian, let alone for a Catholic, not to perceive that Christ is not merely using the phraseology of his times, that he has no intention of purely and simply accepting the ignorance and prejudice of his environment, but that he himself believes in the existence and activity of Satan. He puts us on our guard by his unremitting struggle against the devil, with the result that, finding Satan present to such an extent throughout the New Testament, we are forced to give urgent attention to the problem this creates. Why so many cases of possession? These stories are so frequent in the New Testament, the devil is so constantly present, that one is inclined to wonder whether the whole business is not a little exaggerated. It is obvious that in ordinary life we do not encounter such a relatively large number of cases of possession as sprang up in the path of Jesus. Modern critics, or at least those who are pleased to call themselves independent critics, have not failed to suggest a certain improbability. According to them, the majority of these possessed persons were either maniacs or unbalanced or more or less demented persons. Even if it were so, even if Christ, in treating this type of sick person, had merely been conforming to contemporary ideas of medicine, it is still nonetheless remarkable that he should, with a word, in the majority of these cases, have succeeded in freeing these unhappy persons from their infirmities and restoring them to their normal state. But where one considers all that has been said already, this method of resolving the problem appears a little summary. The Gospels distinguish quite clearly between the sick and the possessed. The latter show striking symptoms of the presence of an alien intelligence within them. This intelligence is hostile to Jesus, and is what we describe as the intelligence of an evil spirit. It would indeed have been astonishing if, after the vast prologue of the temptation in the wilderness, Satan had not intervened in the course of Christ's ministry, or had played only a secondary role. But this is not the case. Christ openly proclaimed his strength, saying he had come to break Satan's dominion over the world. Their struggle, it is true, took place mainly in the sphere of the invisible, the realm of sin and grace, and it will be thus until the end of the world. But, by God's permission, this tremendous secular struggle has also its visible aspects, sometimes spectacular in nature. Yet such episodes are not the heart of the matter. We must remember this. Even if in this present book we dwell on these outer aspects, we have no desire to exaggerate their importance. What is at stake is the souls of men, the choice between heaven and hell, between bliss and damnation. It was therefore part of God's plan for men to make them aware of the powers of Satan and to make this power yield to the Redeemer. There is no reason to believe that the number of cases of possession quoted in the Gospels represent the normal number, either at that period or today. It is possible, and even probable, that such cases would occur with extraordinary frequency in the neighborhood of Jesus. The union in one person of deity and human nature, as in Jesus, Son of Man and Son of God, would, by God's will, give rise to its counterpart in repeated manifestations of diabolism. Possession is in a certain sense a replica, a caricature of the incarnation of the Word. The pagan world and even Judaism itself were beginning to be undermined by that skepticism towards the supernatural, which is one of the characteristics of the present day. The coming of Jesus and the countless cases of possession which occurred around him were a striking revelation of the supernatural world in its complementary aspects, the city of God and the city of Satan. It is in this sense that we declared that the gospel is normative. It sets up principles, provides illumination, establishes laws, and sheds over every age a light which is never to be extinguished. All that we know or believe on the subject of the devil is rooted in the Gospels. Belief in the existence and maleficence of the devil is part of Christian dogma. Our destiny is either demonic or angelic. We shall behold God, like the angels, says Jesus, or we shall be damned with Satan and all his host. It was necessary to establish or re-establish this point before passing to contemporary facts. A rapid survey will be enough to trace developments from New Testament times to the present day. We need, in general, to be on our guard against two dangers of paying either too much attention to Satanism or too little. There have been centuries in which men saw the devil everywhere, and others when he was not considered to be present anywhere. Exaggerations which are equally false, equally deceptive, and both consequently inspired by Satan, the father of lies. In antiquity, it is not possible to say that there was any obsession with demonic activities amongst the early Christians. We could quote texts from St. Paul and St. Peter which are still relevant, and which should be taken as the expression of the strictest reality. We have to struggle against the devil. Moral life is a constant struggle. There is more to life than flesh and blood. The dragon is constantly at work. St. John, in his Apocalypse, said all there was to be said about the vicissitudes of Christian history, but it is undeniable that the dragon has a part of primary importance to play within it. The periods of persecution which are so frequent in the history of the Church are preeminently diabolic. It is also certain the early Christians considered the pagan worship of idols as diabolic in inspiration. In their eyes, the pagan deities were demonic. This is not to say that the fathers of the Church exaggerated. Augustine was well aware of the two cities, which he described with lucidity and vigor, and with all the breadth of vision of a spiritual genius. Some find St. Augustine pessimistic, but if so, it is not induced by theological demonology. He does not ascribe all that is dark and somber in human action to the devil alone. We have our own share of responsibility. On the contrary, he affirms, as we shall recall later, that this dog is chained. The devil can do nothing against us without our own will. His force comes from our consent, and his weakness from our resistance. The most vivid stories of demonic activity handed down to us from Christian antiquity are those of the Desert Fathers, Anthony's struggles at close quarters with the demon, the hermits of the Thebaid, and monks of every order and of all ages had their skirmishes with Satan. Nearer home, St. Martin had his own experiences. If, however, we make a brief survey of the Middle Ages, thumbing the in folios of the great scholastic theologians, we are not overwhelmed by references to demonology. Authors who have made a special study of medieval literature on demonic possession or sorcery consider that the greatest masters, such as Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, were inclined to discredit the alleged miraculous achievements of the sorcerers. In the 15th century, Gerson and Gabriel Biel, the last of the nominalists, disagreed on the question, the first asserting and the second denying the powers of devils over the terrestrial sphere. A dangerous development. Such was the position when, in 1486, there appeared a work destined to have the most widespread repercussions and to influence a whole century towards the most obvious and deplorable exaggeration. It was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, written by two German Dominicans, Jacob Sprenger and Heinrich Institoris, the one professor at the University of Cologne, the other inquisitor in Upper Germany. The work had an enormous circulation. There are known to have been 28 editions in the 15th and 16th centuries. It was the handbook for the witch hunt that followed and stimulated the production of a whole literature of demonology. There was no limit to the number of works published for the use of inquisitors or confessors, dealing exclusively with sorcery and pacts with the devil. The beginning of the 17th century saw a further crop of such works, giving impressive but repulsive details of possession, of monsters, vampires, goblins, familiar spirits, and the like. In 1603, one author, Jourdain Guilbet, published a Discours philosophique, whose academic title cloaked a treatise on incubi and succubi, that is, on sexual intercourse with demons. The bibliography of Yves Plessis, dealing only with French works of demonology, lists almost 2,000 titles. Public opinion tended to regard all human ailments as signs of demonic activity. In his Satan in the Études Carmélitaines, page 363, Monsieur Émile Brouet reproduces a passage from Ambroise Paré, author of the much-quoted remark, "I tended him, and God cured him," as follows: "I would say with Hippocrates, author and father of medicine, that there is something divine in all diseases, which men cannot explain. There are sorcerers, enchanters, poisoners, all venomous, evil, cunning, deceptive, who have made a pact with devils who are their slaves and vassals, and by subtle, diabolic, and unknown means corrupt the body, the understanding, the life, and health of other creatures." Morbid fantasies. Demonology in the 16th century led to an orgy of morbid fantasies. The devil was to be found everywhere. Many stories of demonic infestation were utter fabrications. The anti-Catholic polemics of emergent Protestantism were dominated by Satanism. The whole movement for Protestant reform was haunted from the beginning by the shadow of the demoniac. Although the hunt for sorcerers and sorceresses had begun well before Luther and Calvin, these men certainly did nothing to arrest it, and even quoted both Old and New Testaments as authority for intensifying it. Luther, Melanchthon, and Calvin, writes Monsieur Brouet, believed in Satanism and their followers. The fanatical preachers only exacerbated the national credulity of these converted to the new gospel. Loxit, page 367. Terrifying figures. The total number of accusations of witchcraft quoted by the same author are fantastic. It is true that he suggests that the figures given are subject to great reservation and need closer verification. N. van Werwijk, he writes, estimates that 30,000 accusations were heard in the courts of the Duchy of Luxembourg. L. Ray Ponce, Essai sur la sorcellerie, page 64, suggests the more modest figure of 50,000 executions for Germany, France, and Belgium. A. Luandre, La Sorcellerie, page 124, states that in Lorraine alone, 900 sorcerers were sent to the torture in 15 years, 500 in 3 months, in 1515 in Geneva, 1,000 in the Diocese of Como in 1 year. According to J. Francais, 25 persons were burnt for witchcraft in 3 years at Strasbourg. According to G. Save, La Sorcellerie à Saint-Dié, the total number of cases of suspected sorcery in the Saint-Dié district reached 230 between 1530 and 1629. C. E. Dumont, Justice criminelle des Duchés de Lorraine, volume 3, page 48, estimates that there were 740 trials for witchcraft between 1553 and 1669. A complete list of all witchcraft trials would obviously be of considerable length. Contrary to current belief, however, much endorsed by eminent historians, the fury of the witch hunt did not reach its climax at the end of the 16th century. Outbursts had been rare in the 14th century, becoming more frequent in the 15th and numerous from 1530 onwards. That is to say, in the first half of the 16th century. The first half century was in fact almost as sanguinary as the second half, that is from 1580 to 1620, which was the most ferocious of all. There seems hardly any doubt that the major responsibility for the veritable explosion of demonological literature, which occurred after 1530, can be assigned to Luther and Protestantism. Such was the opinion of Monsignor Jansen in his great history, German Civilization. Luther and the Devil. It is certain that Luther, throughout his teaching, attributed much greater power to the devil than had been done before his day. He claimed to have had personal evidence of this power. He himself, he declared, had seen Satan. Satan, he writes, often appears in disguise. I have seen him with my own eyes, in the shape of a pig, a flaming wisp of straw, etc. He told his friend Myconius that the devil had appeared to him at the Wartburg with the intention of killing him, and that he had often met him in the garden in the form of a black boar. At Coburg in 1530, he had recognized him one night in a star. He walks with me in the dormitory, he wrote, and he has ordered 2 devils to keep a watch on me. They are prying devils. He has given a detailed account of his conversation with the devil. He quotes very certain cases of satanic attacks recounted by his friends. At Sessen, 3 servants had been carried off alive by a demon. In the marsh, Satan had wrung the innkeeper's neck and carried off a soldier in a gust of wind. At Mühlberg, a drunken flute player had met the same fate. At Eisenach, another flute player had been carried off by the devil, although the preacher, Justus Menius, and several other ministers had kept a constant watch on the doors and the windows of the house where he was staying. The body of the first flute player had been recovered from a stream. The other was found in a hazel copse. And Luther vouches for all these happenings with one solemnity. They are not, he writes, idle stories, invented to frighten people, but indeed real happenings, truly alarming, and not childish rumors as some wiseacres would have it. He says further, the devils that have been vanquished, humiliated, and overcome become sprites and goblins, for there are such things as degenerate devils, and I am inclined to think that monkeys are of this nature. This hypothesis seemed to appeal to him, for he returns to it. Serpents and monkeys are more subject to the devil than other animals. Satan dwells in them. He possesses them and uses them to deceive men and do them great harm. Demons are to be found in many countries, but particularly in Prussia. In Lapland, too, there are a great many demons and magicians. In Switzerland, not far from Lucerne, on a very high mountain, there is a lake called Lake of Pilatus, where the devil indulges in all kinds of infamies. In my country, on a high mountain called Polsterberg, Goblin Mountain, there is a lake, and if you cast a stone into it, a storm arises and devastates the surrounding countryside. The lake is full of demons. Satan holds them imprisoned there. But it was not only in his private correspondence or table talk that Luther spoke thus, demonology playing an important part even in his teachings. In 1520, when he was still not entirely detached from the Catholic tradition, he declared that to attribute personal or public misfortunes to the activities of the devil or of wicked men was to sin against the first commandment. But later he saw the devil's hand everywhere. In his great Catechism of 1529, which contains his most cherished beliefs, he states expressly that it is the devil who provokes quarrels, assassinations, sedition, and war, a thesis which, as we shall show later, can be sustained. But the devil also causes thunder, tempests, hail, which destroys crop and animals, and he also spreads pestilence through the air. Presumably, therefore, the poisonous exhausts from modern cars are also his doing. The devil, writes Luther, is a constant menace to the life of Christians. He slakes his wrath by pouring down on them all kinds of evils and calamities, hence the disasters in which so many unfortunates perish, some strangled, others driven mad. It is he who throws children into rivers. It is he who prepares those fatal falls. According to Luther, the devil has immense power. The devil, he writes, is so powerful that he can cause death through a mere leaf. He has more drugs, more phials brimming with poison than all the apothecaries in the world. The devil constantly endangers human life by his activities. It is he who infects the air. These are not rare or isolated quotations from Luther's works. Some of the assertions he makes are quite incredible. He is persuaded, for instance, that Satan sometimes has intercourse with young girls, who thereupon become pregnant. The children born of this horrid union are the sons of the devil, and have no souls. According to him, they are only heaps of flesh. For the following, rather summary reason, the devil can make a body, but he cannot make a spirit. Satan is therefore the soul of these children, and he concludes dogmatically, is it not horrible and terrifying to think that Satan can thus torture people and have the power to beget children? After Luther, one can imagine the effect of these repeated assertions, coming from such a man, on Protestant churches and Lutheran authors. The devil figures in almost every Lutheran sermon, and popular literature swarmed with hosts of demons. Johann Nass, a Catholic writer from Germany, waxed indignant over this proliferation of satanic literature. In the space of a few years, he wrote in 1588, so many books on the devil have been published and circulated, books written in the name of the devil, printed in the name of the devil, bought and devoured in the name of the devil. A great fuss is made of them, and their authors become famous amongst all the so-called servants of the word. Formerly, he adds, pious Christians forbade their children to name the spirit of evil, or to describe him by one of his horrible names. It was forbidden to swear by the devil, for Solomon has said, when the sinner swears by the devil, he curses his own soul. But nowadays, we preach about the devil, we write in the devil's name, and it is all taken to be just and praiseworthy. And I can tell you why. It is because the grandfather of your evangelicals, the holy patriarch, in quotation marks, Martin Luther, was the first to set an example. In 1595, a superintendent, that is to say, a Lutheran bishop, André Kelicius, decided to satisfy public demand by publishing a complete treatise on demonic possession, and he left no doubt that he considered his work indispensable. Almost everywhere, afar and at home, the number of possessed persons is so great that it surprises and afflicts us, and this perhaps is the true plague by which our Egypt and all its helpless inhabitants is doomed to perish. In his own country, Mecklenburg, he estimated that there were at least 30 possessed persons who were spreading fear and alarm everywhere. Frail and weak creatures, he wrote, women and girls are greatly troubled by all they are constrained to see and hear. Many of them have renounced both faith and charity, for they have taken counsel of demons, which is anti-Christian and idolatrous behavior. He then described at length the ravages of demonology in his century. But enough of these unhappy memories. In our own day, such exaggerations are no doubt impossible. We shall now turn to look at the symptoms of the presence of Satan in our modern world, and shall therefore pass at once to 19th century France. Can one still seriously speak of witchcraft in a period so close to our own? We shall endeavor to confine our answer to established certainties, avoiding all exaggerations.